Hey guys, Mustached here to review Final Fantasy VII Remake. Now, keep in mind that this review will be only focusing on the remake and not Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, which is the second part of the remake. With that in mind, let's get down into it. So, of course, we'll dive into story and gameplay, respectively. Now, of course, this is definitely one of the biggest remakes probably ever announced in quite a long time. I mean, there were some pretty big ones with high expectations, like Resident Evil 4 probably being another high expectation remake, and pretty much meeting the standard of what a remake should offer. Now, this one was going to be even more challenging, if we're being real. I mean, Final Fantasy VII is a long game. If I'm not mistaken, even the original game was 4 disc long. So separating it as such seemed to be a continued main focus with even the remake and covering quite a number of things within the first section of Final Fantasy VII. And going into the story is that we're focusing on Cloud and the beginnings of his adventures with Avalanche to take down Shinra, the evil corporation that is out to manipulate people one way to another to get what they want, which is still being uncovered to this moment, but I digress. But there is another threat on the horizon, that being the return of Sephiroth. Sephiroth was an early ally of Cloud, but after some events he went his own separate way, causing some serious damage to Cloud's hometown, and by proxy becoming quite the rival slash everyone's fanfic yaoi companion, I suppose. But hey, it is what it be sometimes. At any rate, what makes Final Fantasy VII interesting as a remake is that there is some contention with it, which I wouldn't place on other remakes such as I mentioned earlier, like Resident Evil 4 Remake. And, of course, I am talking about these spirit entity things that interfere throughout the story. Now, these change the outcomes of who lives and who dies, which is a already different outcome from the original Final Fantasy VII. And this is quite the contrivance and easy escape button, to let you know that there's this gap of how did the writers intend to shift things, and this is definitely not one of the best ways to go about doing it. Now, luckily, I will say this in advance, that their role in the second movie, while they are present still, I still haven't seen them be as active as they were in the first game. I think they're still in the background, they still float around from time to time, but they don't seem to. I think there's 1 or 2 instances of them interfering with something or other, but they don't usually try interfering, which I would probably argue for this game starts to settle in the middle to ending, especially the ending section of this game. But what I really like about the story is it still settles down and lets you get to know the characters. And furthermore, it definitely expands outward from things you would have seen in the original, or just expanding expanding upon those elements. Now, keeping in with that compromise of the entities, I suppose, I would still argue that the writing outside of that stills allow it to be at least like a 6 out of 10 in terms of story. It's not the most solid start to the story in terms of, where we are and trying to get us into it when that sort of stuff is interfering and, causing such a great shift in what to expect. But I would still say that there's still so much more in service of the story rather than against it, so that's where I'm leaning on that. However, where this game picks up as a remake, which is probably should be its focus anyway, is the gameplay. First, you can press square a lot. Now, originally, obviously, with original RPGs like the original Final Fantasy VII, you had to wait until your ATB filled, and then you could finally attack with the character it filled up with. That's how the earlier games operated. Here, the ATB system still exists, but instead you're able to slash as many times as you want. Now, being careless with your swings is still not necessarily good, but you build up ATB with attacks as well. Now, these ATB attacks allow you to do your higher damaging attacks. Your finisher move, for example, Clouds, for example, being the braver attack, or using elemental magic. And of course, using the assess button to assess, your enemies and figure out their weaknesses and use that particular element to whittle them down by a wider margin. Now, where this game excels at, and I mean excels at, is the level of escalation. This is a term I've used in other games before, but by God, both this and its follow-up are masterclass of how to do the level of escalation. It always feels just challenging enough where it's rewarding, but never too aggravating. Like, you feel like, ooh, I'm being pushed to my limit pretty consistently throughout the entire game, and that's no easy feat, I would argue. There's usually more power creep, or, in other instances, the level of escalation, as I've already experienced in, say, Baldur's Gate 3 as a comparison, is actually relatively high, which was something I was not expecting from a game that is so heavily, rewarded for its achievements, but I digress. But this game, it completely has mastered its level of escalation here, always keeping you on your toes, and mainly through the enemy bosses. Those are your challenge markers to show you how challenging it is, while again keeping it pretty consistent with you're still always able to win that outcome. And of course, keeping tabs on your two allies, who you have available, whoever you choose. There will be some instances where you'll be stuck with certain allies, but that's neither here nor there. This doesn't really detract from anything. But you can pick your other allies, you can use their abilities, you can help boost each other up with your ATB filling up, and you have your slots to fill in with the materia, which can help you do the magic as well as boosting up your other stats as well, like your generic HP and MP and stuff like that. So there's plenty of ways to keep up with the game. And what I like about this is that they made the materia system relatively easy to understand. You just slot it right in. From what I played of the original Final Fantasy, of course I didn't complete it. I didn't really get around to materia, I don't think. And at least from when I remember my brother playing it, I remember the materia system being a little bit more convoluted, or at least like the aggravation of always have to changing out your slots or something along those lines. I'm not sure if that's accurate, so I'm not going to say that that's the case per se, but I can imagine an older system having a little bit more of a finickier system that would seem to track at least. So I suppose it's possible, but at any rate, that's not here. Gladly, your ATB system is pretty solid. You just slot it right in, whatever material you want to use, and you're good to go. And as you progress through the game, you get items such as like a bracelet with more materia slots. Therefore, you can always bulk up on your materia to help compensate for missing spells you may have, and therefore compensate for if you have an enemy where mayhaps one of your allies or even your main character does not have the magical ability. Let's say, for example, someone else in your party will. So that way you can consistently use that magical element with that enemy and then whittle it down significantly faster that way, while focusing on smaller attacks with your main character or whatever you need to do to survive. Now, with all that being said, the system being really, really solid, there is some little, linearness to the story, or gameplay rather, and that does expand significantly, I would argue, in the second part of the game, but we'll get to that significantly later, though. So, surprisingly, there are still a lot of improvements that the second part does over the first part, but that's for, of course, when we get to the Let's Play of Rebirth, so that's going to be way later down the line. At any rate, for the sake of this game, I will say that the system is sufficient, and, well, more than sufficient. It is experienced and really, really steady, simplistic, and satisfying, most importantly. And your weapons can upgrade as well, so you're always, again, upgrading your gear to keep up, and the game always, the game's placement of said items is so strategic. It's like you get the thing right when you need it. It always feels like. So that is always very satisfying as well. And I would very much argue that that's the case in Rebirth. But again, that's a question for when that review is up. Anyway, so every system is in conjunction with each other. The enemies are just pushing you just consistently enough throughout the game. So I would argue that this gameplay is, again, masterclass. This is like a 10 out of 10 gameplay game, if you ask me. Like, I am struggling to figure out it. Well, I'd probably have to push it to a 9 out of 10 just because I know that Rebirth actually enhances a lot of that experience to a degree. So, for as much as the solidness is there, I have to keep in mind of what is to come. So that is something I am keeping in mind of. So in its own right, and that's still an impressive score. A 9 out of 10 is nothing to scoff at it here on my reviews. That is hard to earn. So you know that this game is definitely worth picking up, at least in regards to gameplay specifically. Now, of course, I can get into Rebirth and what that is all about, and we can talk about that in its review, but at any rate, that is my full review for Final Fantasy VII Remake, and I guess I'll just say Part 1, even though I don't have to, since it does have a different title system but whatever. Anyway. So we'll be back for Rebirth, but for the time being, that is where we will end this particular review. So if you ended up enjoying it, then please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. Also make sure to check out those links in the description. One will head you over to my petition to help out small YouTubers. Second to my PayPal, where you can help support me and my channel directly. Third to my Discord server, you can join, collab, shield, do all that cool stuff for free. And until next time, everyone, bye-bye.